Hi everyone, and welcome to the next instalment of our video series created as part of the Law, Environment and Religion course here at Yale University. My name's Ben Mylius. I'm an Australian law graduate and a current student in the Master's program at Yale Law School.
My name is Mariana Lo, and I'm a master's student at the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies.
And we're really pleased today to welcome Jedediah Purdy, who's the Robinson O. Everett Professor of Law at Duke University School of Law. Jed teaches constitutional, environmental and property law, and writes prolifically on issues at the intersection of law as well as social and political thought in publications ranging from the Cornell Law Review to the Huffington Post. And his forthcoming book, which we'll be really keen to chat with him about today, is entitled After Nature, A Politics for the Anthropocene. Jed, thanks so much for coming in today.
Thanks, I'm glad to be here.
So I can start us off. One of the focuses of our class has been how environmental stories and our own personal experiences bring people to environmental consciousness and environmental work. So you've also talked and written about the importance of stories and experience in environmental work. So could you tell us a little bit about your childhood in West Virginia or specific memories that or experiences you had becoming acquainted with nature, the environment?
Sure. So yeah, I grew up in central West Virginia on a small farm. I was raised by people who were not from there, and it was a place where most people were from there and had been for a long time. So we were called, the term was outsiders. But the design my parents had in moving to that place was to try to become very much of the place. They were motivated by an idea that people like Wendell Berry had been voicing and Gary Snyder of resettling America in some ways, trying to rebuild a more place-based sense of culture than the one that their generation had grown up in. And I do think in a very basic way that I'm still unfolding my experience of everything from moving around in the world day to day to trying to think to writing is in some ways still marked by the topography of that place, actually. Quite literally, it's topography. To me, the geography of thinking is the geography of a place that has both lowlands and highlands that are connected by ridges and slopes, so that you can traverse it on two very different spatial logics, depending whether you're following streams or following lines of a ridge. And in the absence of that, thinking is very difficult for me because there's only one way to get from one place to another. I didn't know that until my mid-30s, but had been true for a long time. It's also a place that was ruined a long time before we got there. It was ruined by clear cutting. It was ruined by intensive sheep farming on very steep slopes in response to the demand for wool for uniforms during the World Wars. And it was ruined by large, carrying capacity-wise, large and crowded population trying to scratch out a living with very little cash economy. So it's gullied, the soil is poor, the streams are in the bottoms are slow-moving and silty, although they're still sort of swift and clean up high. And it's a place that's vulnerable. It's vulnerable in a lot of ways. For example, it lies over natural gas fields, whose availability for fracking is, as I understand it, sort of an open question right now, geologically speaking, but is not an open question actually legally speaking, because the state is very pro-extraction, has long been, and because the form of legal ownership there is mostly based on a division between ownership of the surface, which the people who live there have, and ownership of the mineral rights beneath, which tends to be in the hands of gas and coal companies and holding companies for those, and implies the right to come in on the surface and drill. So it's a place that if you love it, loving it sort of prepares you for heartbreak in a lot of ways, just implicitly. You always sort of know that about the place. I didn't know that either for a long time, and it took me years to figure out why the place I was from didn't make me feel entirely at home. And some of the things that I'm telling you about it now are part of the answers, I think, to that question.
Well, and on that front, obviously a really multi-layered sort of sense of, or set of understandings of this particular place where you spent a lot of time. Can you tell us a bit more about what it was when you came or started having those different awarenesses? Was that quite early on with your parents that you got a sense of these other kind of complexities that were impinging on that place where you were growing up?
Oh, that's a good question. It must have been. I mean, I knew about drilling when I was very young, and I knew that happened to people who would rather it hadn't. I think I learned about it systematically much later. Between high school and college, I spent a year working full-time in environmental politics back in West Virginia, and then really got to know the geography of the state in a very different way from the way that you do when it's just what's given to you. You learn it as a geography of resources, a geography of conflicts. You learn it jurisdictionally. That was probably what tied it together for me for the first time. And the thing that I told you about the geography of thinking and the difference between a place that has ridges and valleys and a place that doesn't, I figured that out when I started to have dreams about landscape about 3 years ago. Dreams where the Piedmont region of North Carolina, which is where I live, would just crop up mysteriously these slopes that wouldn't stop. And in the dream, I'd move through meadows and through forests and then to some sort of high pasture. And I could tell you exactly where each of these were in the landscape of the Piedmont. I mean, I could draw them on the little old tobacco farm roads and college towns. And the sense of relief that I woke up with and delight at having discovered this additional dimension of the terrain where I was living was the feeling I was trying to plumb and articulate when I figured out what I just told you. So, but a bunch of different things.
Yeah. I suppose I wonder as well on that front, when you're talking about this sort of the geographies of thinking and things like that, something we've talked a lot about in our class is as Mariana mentioned, the way in which environmental issues are sort of an intriguing intersection for people between these big, grand political and social communal questions and then very private personal experiences. And in particular, we've talked about a lot of people's stories have been lensed through experiences they had growing up or in places that were special to them, and thinking through, well, how does that look now as we are all doing work in professional capacities. So has your sense of the relevance of that place changed for you since you came up to Harvard and then we're here at Yale and are now teaching in a law school, which is a very, very different kind of an environment to be in?
Oh, sure. And the observation you make about environmental issues often bridging, or maybe not even bridging, but just simultaneously resonating with two very different parts of identity, parts of experience, and focal points for work. Personal on the one hand and systemic on the other. The distance between those two focal points and an interest in bridging them actually came to me when I was a law student here. In my first year, the introductory course on environmental law and policy was taught just up the hill in the old FES building. And twice a week, I guess, listening to the lectures on the technical fine points of the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, I would just feel this palpable dissonance between what had brought those of us among the law students who thought you have to go take environmental law in your first year because this is really important, and of course the forestry students who were there, what had brought us there, which was much more personal and aesthetic and ethical than it was technical. And the technocratic, the intensely technocratic character of what we were learning. And of course, we had come to learn technical things. We didn't want to be lectured about Thoreau, but it seemed as if we couldn't find the connection, even. And so a couple of friends and I put together a seminar which we persuaded the environmental law professor to let us teach as an extra credit section the next time environmental law was taught, where we read foundational texts in the politics and culture of environment. And we tried to read them alongside the portions of the course that in some way resonated with them. So we read Thoreau when we talked about land use, and we read Silent Spring when we talked about air pollution, and just tried to begin bringing back in the richer set of cultural sources and experiences that had brought people to that classroom in the first place. And that was really the starting point for a lot of work that I've done since I began teaching, which is to try to excavate the cultural and political and imaginative preconditions of some of the major episodes of environmental politics and lawmaking, and try to see how imagination and very concrete uses of state power have actually been linked, and linked partly by the kinds of democratic mobilization that new forms of imagination sometimes make possible.
And why do you think that it's so, I guess, easy, for want of a better word, for those particular technocratic styles of understanding, in this context, the natural world and those kind of relationships? Why do they become so dominant so easily, do you think?
Well, I think some of it has to do with an impulse toward objectivity in a time when the politically fraught and partisan character of values disputes is so close to the surface and raw and closely fought. You could sort of describe the drive to objectivity, I guess, on two levels. One is what I just said, which locates it in this particular moment of partisan division, when most of the action in environmental regulation is in the administrative and regulatory domain rather than the legislative domain, which adds an additional layer to the need for at least the appearance of objectivity. You need a vocabulary that doesn't seem like you're just mobilizing your own values and telling people how to live. I think you could also talk about it, as Doug Kaiser has, as a sort of deeper kind of epistemic and ethical mistake that just tries to artificially foreclose the set of questions we ask because it thinks of that as the liberal or the rational way to proceed. And I think there's a lot to that too.
So speaking about vocabulary, I suppose, we wanted to talk a little bit about this concept of the Anthropocene, which is in the title of your forthcoming book and is been a focus of your recent writing. So what is the Anthropocene to you?
Well, as you know, it's a made-up word that is intended to designate something like the geological age of humanity, meaning a time when people are a force and maybe the force in shaping the development of the planet. I think of it as being the formulation of the idea as being a response both to the fact of the massive and ubiquitous human effect on natural processes, but also as a cultural and philosophical development in a time when people are becoming more and more aware that talking about nature has always been a way of talking about how people should live together, treat the natural world, and treat one another. It's always been a contested cultural concept and not just a fact. Whether you're talking about the naturalness of a certain kind of marriage or a certain gendered division of labor, or whether you're talking about the natural trajectory of development for a continent, which was a huge piece of shaping national ideology for the U.S. in the 18th and 19th centuries. I also think this, that talking about the Anthropocene is a political and ethical bid to generate a way of speaking that can make somewhat more tractable for us the ways that the world we live in the future is going to be the world that we've shaped. It's going to be the world that we've made. Talking about the Anthropocene is an attempt to seed or to begin generating a vocabulary that could be useful in taking responsibility for that kind of world-shaping influence.
When on that question of responsibility, I think you talk in an article you published last week about this idea that sort of key concepts that we've considered natural, as you say, in our kind of communal vocabulary have fallen one by one. So first, the idea that politics, which we once thought was a kind of divine thing, has fallen away, or that understanding has fallen away. Then economics, and now this idea of nature not being natural anymore. So as far as this question of responsibility goes, what kinds of responsibility or ways of thinking about responsibility open up if we do have that recognition that nature is not natural anymore?
I'm pausing because I think in some ways the question is, how do I want to say this? It's one that's hard, and part of the reason it's hard is that talking about responsibility can sound easy and natural. There's a certain flow to the thought that if the world that we live in is the world that we make, then of course it's our responsibility, and so to see it clearly just is to take responsibility for it. And then you would say, well, look at, and I think this is right, but I'm going to say in a minute why I think it's also not an altogether helpful way of talking, or why it has some limitations. You would say, for example, well, we need to think about the way that, this is not, of course, news to anyone in this room, but the way that climate change creates and intensifies not just a series of disruptions of baseline natural processes, which of course it does, but also a global geography of inequality, of unequal vulnerability to exogenous shocks, of pressures of scarcity that are going to get played out in either market-mediated or other geopolitically mediated ways of allocating claims on the food that's grown in Africa in the next 100 years, the water of the Middle East in the next 100 years. All of these questions of distribution and relative power are going to be joint products of the pressure that we're putting on natural processes and the institutions of human collaboration and exploitation that we put in place. And it's all in our hands. That's the basic thought. Then here's the difficulty. I say in the article that you mentioned that thinking about the Anthropocene can become a meditation on our inability to do anything about everything, meaning that responsibility has to have an agent. That is, there has to be an entity, an institution, an artificial person, probably not a natural person, that can do something commensurate to the problem. And as with some other problems of global scale and terrific complexity, we actually have this tremendous mismatch between the institutions that let us bind ourselves collectively to a commitment or an order or a self-restraint and the scale of the problem.
When on that front as well, if I could just read another
Please.
little brief quote from the article, you say, the Anthropocene means that human power is greater than it's ever been, but in some ways human control is weaker than it's ever been. Climate change crystallizes this paradox. We brew the storms, bring the droughts, raise the seas, but we can't choose or even entirely understand how these changes shape the world. And so I guess my question is, as well as these dialogues about responsibility, is there also a discussion to be had about the limits about our understanding of the limits of our knowledge, what it's possible for us to know and predict, and what it's not possible to know or predict, and how that should shape the way that we think about governance, do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, again, that Doug Kaiser has written really eloquently about this. But to put it simply, on a variety of fronts, I think there's a strong case for a renewal of some context-sensitive version of a precautionary principle in a case where risk, that is quantifiable, manageable unknowns, turn into uncertainty, which is to say really blank spots on the epistemic map where it's really hard to say what happens. We need to make the threshold for appropriate action less something in the nature of an artificially objective bottom line in a cost-benefit analysis that tries to know more than it can know, and something more to do with a kind of imaginative forecasting about what it is that might happen that we most want to avoid and what you have to do to stop that. The model of decision-making by traditional cost-benefit analysis is obviously admirable as an ambition to social rationality, to deploy power and resources efficiently. But it becomes a kind of mania if you try to do it in the absence of the kind of knowledge that you need, the epistemic preconditions of being able to make the efficiency goal play out.
I'll take another one, if I might then. I suppose in terms of that idea you mentioned about context sensitivity, and thinking back to your earlier comments about the particularity of places and how important it is to have it, to keep a sense of that particularity, even as, for example, those of us who are lawyers are thinking in very grand, abstract terms about principles and theories and things like that. How do those two intersect for you in, I suppose, particularly in your thinking about law, the general and the particular, and what does it look like to talk about a law that's really attentive to the particular features of place?
Well, I guess that I maybe like to think of it this way, if I can re-inflect the question slightly. Something I think is really interesting and important is this. Law creates something that I called in a piece of writing a few years ago a geography of experience. And what I mean by that is that it sets up the framework in which it becomes possible to encounter the natural world in certain ways and not possible to do so in other ways. Now, the kind of classic 20th century example of this is the creation of the national parks in the late 19th and early 20th centuries and the wilderness system in the mid-20th century, roughly. And all of this was done, especially the creation of the wilderness system, to make it possible for people to encounter a specific version of nature whose value lay in the fact that it was meant to be as close as possible to how we would imagine the world without us. And to do that in a particular attitude, which wilderness advocates talked about as humility, sort of going into the wild unarmed. And the people who advocated for it really felt that if the continent were not regulated to preserve these spaces, there would be kinds of experience that they couldn't have. And in a way, there would be kinds of people that they couldn't be, kinds of lives that they couldn't have. So that's an easy example in some ways, because it's so clearly about zoning the public lands of the continent to create a certain kind of experience. But I think that how we regulate agricultural systems, for example, can do very much the same thing. So think about whether you structure the FDA's slaughterhouse inspection system in such a way that there are sufficient inspectors available to deal with an infrastructure of small-scale, regional, and local slaughterhouses, which are a major bottleneck for local meat production, and throw that production into an infrastructure that works at a much bigger regional scale at one of its key points. There's a way that there was no sense in the development of the current state of FDA inspection that it was a geography of experience that was being shaped. But really what it's doing is creating a world in which it's much harder for people to encounter both the satisfactions of living close to animals, coming to know them, sort of collaborating with them in a certain way up to the point of their death, and also being closer to the ethical challenge of the killing itself. You could say the same thing about every aspect of the regulation of agriculture at the national level that tilts it toward either the kind of, let's say, integrated or neo-traditional or community-oriented agriculture that actually brings people into the experience of putting their hands in the dirt and practically living out an enriched understanding of the systems that they're involved in when they get food, versus one that, whether through the way it regulates fertilizer runoff or the way that it permits subtherapeutic levels of antibiotic provision in swine facilities, tilts things in the direction of much more anonymous and concealed kind of food production.
When on that note, I very much like that idea of a geography of experience, and it resonates with the kind of ideas of geographies of thinking you were talking about before. If I'm right in thinking you're talking about the Duke Law article you wrote, where you were exploring those ideas, something else I took from that article, which you've summarised really nicely for us there, is this idea that law is inevitably normative, which is to say that we're not just creating, in your example, the experiences that someone is having in a pre-given place, so much as creating the kinds of places it's even possible for them to experience and the kinds of experiences it's even possible for them to have. And yet there's a really, I think in a whole lot of disciplines, we have people here today from law, from religious studies and from environmental studies and ecology. And in all of these disciplines, there's still a strong strand of thinking that aims at the kind of objectivity you were talking about. So this pretension to our ability to sort of be describing and regulating neutrally or from nowhere, to use Professor Kaiser's phrase. I mean, I suppose again the question is, how do we get away from that, or do we need to sort of find ways to temper that as we think about these more subjective kind of questions?
I guess I think of it as a matter of acknowledging that this may not get to the nerve of the problem in a way. How do we get away from it? I think we acknowledge that there is no neutrality in these questions, and then we look around and see that we're still okay. That hasn't made us illiberal toward other human beings. It actually just concedes that these kinds of laws have always been invested implicitly or explicitly with ideas about how we fit in the natural world, what we have at stake in it, how we can get right with it, and what the value of that is. A really high-toned example, if you were to tell a popular history of how we started thinking that in order to talk about the legitimacy of law and politics, we had to rise to a perspective of neutrality, you would start with John Rawls's theory of justice in 1971, where he tries to give an account of the legitimacy of the liberal state on those terms. And he says himself late in that book that there are some questions you just can't think of in that vocabulary, that you need what he calls a metaphysics, that is a theory of what the world is and what our place in it is, and that our relation to, I think he says, to animals and to the natural world is of that kind. I think that was right, and I think a close look at everything we've done in this domain confirms it.
So you've written about, in that kind of vein, the different environmental imaginaries or the ways that Americans particularly have conceived of our relationship to nature. You know, there's the romantic or the utilitarian or the providential. Do you think that there's a new paradigm kind of evolving perhaps with the Anthropocene concept or with agrarianism?
Yeah, I do, but it's hard for me to encapsulate it. In fact, I would rather say I wouldn't try to encapsulate it. But I think there's a way that if you think of what the paradigmatic problems of the different generations of lawmaking and imagination have been, there was a sort of providential vision in which the basic problem was to make the continent bloom according to a very specific European agrarian vision, developmental vision, and a whole body of laws, exemplarily the Homestead Act, but scores and scores of others were set up to turn Americans into farmers and miners and turn the land into a certain kind of economically productive landscape. The paradigm of the romantic view of nature that did so much to shape the parks and wilderness was how to preserve a place where a certain kind of aesthetic or spiritual investment in nature remains possible. The paradigmatic problem of the conservationist or utilitarian view of the natural world that did so much to shape and justify the expansion of the national state, the regulatory state, especially emblematically under Teddy Roosevelt, but not only, was the expert management of large systems of resources with a properly utilitarian goal, the greatest good of the whole political community over time. And we can think of media-based pollutants like air and water as the paradigmatic problem of the first generation of environmental lawmaking, ecologically inflected environmental lawmaking in the 1970s. So I think we're coming into a period where we have two paradigm problems. One is food, in which we've developed, I think, the beginnings of a politics and body of law reform, and also a very strong beginning to a culture of trying to articulate what's at stake in approaching food and food systems differently. And the other is energy, where I think we're really just beginning on both fronts. And in fact, here it seems to me that the policy thinking is running well ahead of attempts to express what the kind of ideal of a different energy system would be, what kind of landscape it would make, what kinds of communities it would make. And these are emblematic because they both focus on points of perennial, everyday metabolism between people and the world, where we consume parts of it in order to keep living our lives, and we make it, literally form it, the atmospheric system, the soil system, and everything else, by the way that we use it. And I think that metabolism that's often been invisible except, say, as a source of pollutants in earlier periods of thinking is right at the nerve of the Anthropocene situation, where it's the intersection of people and the world rather than the relationship between a pair of abstract binaries that we're interested in.
Well, to take you back to that point about metaphysics, and as you say, this idea that rules sort of suggested that there are particular things we can't talk about without having some sense of a metaphysics, which I guess goes to that normative point before. Yeah. It seems to me that one of the challenges in talking about something like metaphysics, and maybe the reason that law and science have avoided that kind of talk, is because it's so contested, and you use that word in your article, and it's so possible for, even though we might pretend to be on a level playing field, for my metaphysics to be better than yours or Mariana's or so on and so forth. So I guess the question is, how do we...
I'm sure yours are great.
Well, you know, I hope they're okay. I'm working on them still. But if we want to bring that kind of, that level of engagement or that aspect of experience back into those public conversations, I'd be really curious how we can do that in a way that keeps the space for the quieter voices and the smaller metaphysics, or the more the more subtle metaphysics, those kind of things.
So, tell me a little more about what you have in mind.
Well, I suppose in the sense that what I understand Rawls to mean when he's talking about metaphysics is the kinds of, in some sense, really intimate experiences we were talking about before, and people's very personal senses of places and their meaning and the kind of spiritual overtones that those things might have. And in addition to those things being hard to talk about sometimes in the public realm because they're perceived to be personal, they, I think, according to this particular kind of liberal objective tradition, have always been rejected as being insufficient for a base for our kind of community life.
Yeah.
So if we're saying that they're not, we need to have that in our discussions. How do we do that?
Yeah. So again, I think that there's some, some reassurance in history in the following way, that the use of what we're calling metaphysics, and which we could also just talk about as worldview or sort of fundamental ethical and aesthetic relations to the natural world, it's had two characteristics. One is that it's always been intensely part of a democratic argument about what the country is doing and why, that's had the same defects, limitations, and exclusions as the larger democratic argument at any point, and that's itself a long and troubling history in the US and elsewhere, but has also been just as open-ended and just as messy and multifarious as the other arguments. So there's, in as much as something that worries people is when you start talking about metaphysics, you're talking about something that tends to be totalitarian or absolute. I think that's not the character of a democratic contest over basic values. But then the second question is something that I think is subtler and nicer, which is, it can feel sort of awful to drag these things out into the public square. There's something sort of decorous and respectful about maintaining a sort of space for experiences you don't have to justify. You can just have them. And I think that's one of the most sort of humane aspects of the liberal idea of political justification, is the way that it lets people be to pursue their own projects of insight and so on. I guess I think that when, how to say it, people don't, precisely for that reason, people who want to drag their intimate metaphysical, their values and intimate experiences into the public square just to do it, are often just not going to be very appealing, and they'll go away, we can hope. And if we don't think that, then we don't believe in democracy. And that might be true too, but that's harder and longer. But if the world is getting changed in a way that maybe without anyone acknowledging it, maybe with the issue never being raised, is going to drive your kind of value into a corner or wipe it out, which is often what brings people into the public square to try to voice these things, then it really is just what you have to do. And part of the history of environmental politics is people doing that when they have to. And that's not necessarily pleasant, but it's what's available. It's what you can do. You have to try to explain why the thing that matters to you might matter enough that there could be a collective decision to steer things in such a way that it remains alive and possible.
And on that front, as you say, sort of bringing those other voices in, or speaking to those other voices of people and convincing them of your views. Something I'm interested in is how, thinking about the kind of contemporary landscape and I guess demographies in developed countries, certainly in Australia, and I think probably here in the US as well, increasingly populations are based in cities or very urban, very environments that are very human-made and human-mediated. And I think one of the statistics is that the average Australian child spends more time inside nowadays than a maximum security prisoner, for what that is worth. So I suppose the question is...
But under different conditions.
That's, well, one would hope. The question, I suppose, is how do we communicate the value of those, again, harking back to this idea of personal natural experiences to people who might be living in inner city New York City or Chicago or Washington, DC, and don't have the luxury of heading out to the farm or going hiking in the Sierras or something like that.
So one thing that I have really admired about the on-the-ground work of the contemporary food movement as I've observed it is that there's a lot of, despite this somewhat elite and effete profile of the movement, which everyone knows about and knows to acknowledge, and which is sort of inevitable when you're talking about something that's in important ways market-mediated in an economy that's going to turn anything people decide they value into a luxury good if they can pay for it. Granting that, there's a lot of awareness of an attempt to be concretely sensitive to these kinds of things by generating garden spaces, food system awareness, incorporating education in food systems and local garden sites into work in public schools, for example, or in community organizations, certainly where I live, and I know from friends here in New Haven as well. So in that sense, I think that there are people doing that work who are trying to acknowledge in a really concrete way that the implication of what they think is an implication for everyone, and who are trying to overcome the structural inequalities of distribution that are going to inflect the way any value that's involved in resources is going to get distributed. It's just that's a cross-cutting issue in an unequal society like this one. Obviously, an important thing is to try to engage in those spaces in a way that's culturally competent and sensitive and open. But again, that's true anytime you're trying to persuade someone who's not you of the value of participating in something that you think is valuable. So it's not entirely satisfactory, partly because I think the setting in which we try to do any of these things is deeply unsatisfactory. But I'm not sure that it's a blind spot as much as a problem that people are trying to grapple with.
And on the question of audience, who do you hope to reach with your work, or who do you see yourself in dialogue with?
That's a good question. You know, they say that you should write for an imagined audience, and I don't think I have one, really. I don't think I ever have. If I do, it's someone who, for one reason or another, has come to be, or might come to be, bothered by the same thing that's bothering me when I'm writing. And so the practical payoff, if there is one for the reader, has very much to do with where the reader is and what she's trying to figure out at the time. I find that you really can't control the way writing is received or the effect that it has. So really all you can do is get hold of a question that you think is genuinely a question and is open and hard enough that it's worth trying to understand better, whether it's by diving into empirics or just trying to think hard and for a long time about what the shape of the problem seems to be to you. And then have a certain confidence that it's not entirely idiosyncratic, that experience, and that it'll find its way to other people who have the same question. In my experience, those are sometimes law professors and law students. There's sometimes people working in nonprofits, either at the national legislative lobbying kind of level or in a very local way. There's sometimes undergraduates who are thinking about law school, or just people in the community, maybe after years of on and off activism, thinking about their own frustrations and what they want to do. So I guess what I mean to say is that I don't so much think of myself as having an audience as I am intermittently pleased to discover that I have one, often one that I didn't know about, and that's doing something I might not have anticipated with something that I've done.
When on that note of thinking about audiences and the way that they engage with your work and the way that you engage with audiences, are there particular things at the moment that you would, for example, if there is someone watching today who is less familiar with some of these questions, the things that you would recommend as primers or really important introductions, or equally things that you're reading at the moment that you're finding really are sources of new ideas and new thinking for you?
Gosh, I hadn't thought about that for a while. Things that I go back to. I have so many quarrels in the particular with Wendell Berry, but I think that to read the core chapters of The Unsettling of America is really to see the beginning of a conversation in politics about food that is essential to understand where we are and where we're going right now. You would think that everyone would have read this, but I find not everyone has. I think the core chapters of Michael Pollan's Omnivore's Dilemma remain an absolutely fantastic introduction to the systems logic of the food system, and people should still pick it up. There's a dearth of really good literature in food world, and that is a good piece. There's a little book called Radical Hope by a classicist, literary scholar, and psychoanalyst named Jonathan Lear. There's a study of what can happen when the culture that has made your identity possible goes out of existence and you have to try to rebuild a new identity in a situation of cultural desolation. It has to do with the cultural devastation of the Native American nation on the Great Plains around the turn of the last century. I found it intensely, strangely resonant for thinking about the cultural dimensions of climate change and other kinds of environmental revolution and loss. Those are three things off the top of my head. I don't know whether I would stand by them in 5 minutes.
I'll hunt them down from the library. I mean, and then in terms of that, given that there are so many things, as you've just alluded to there, that are so urgent and so challenging, how do you decide how to spend your days, or the kinds of ways in which you engage with these issues?
Well, I find that that it's actually, for most of us, just psychologically impossible. For me and the people I know, it's psychologically impossible to try to step outside the shape of my days and sort of rationally allocate my energy according to a calculus of urgency. I find that instead I have to find my way to ways of spending my days that make it possible for me to spend the next day and the next day as well, and to imagine days that are years in the future. So that means a mix of engaging in local politics and activism in a very civilian and unexceptional way. Teaching, which I think is just a joy. I think it's a very special kind of human relationship where you try to make yourself useful to other people who are coming at something in common but from a different angle and with different uses for it. And it means writing about whatever it is that I suspect might be a question I have in common with other people at the moment, especially if I suspect that they might not know yet that we have the question in common. Those are my favorites, because that, I think, is where writing and scholarship can go even a little bit farther, at best, in the contribution that it makes than in simply helping people to sort out a question they already know they have, though that's also totally worthwhile. And that last part is very specific, of course, to doing the kind of work that I do and trying to do it in a way that is helpful.
And so I think to close, we wanted to ask what gives you hope, and what are the seeds of change that you see?
Well, we each have our own temperament, and I seem to have the blessing of a temperament that doesn't give up on macro scale questions or get fundamentally depressed by them. Maybe that sometimes I think that's irresponsible of me, that it indicates some kind of lack of emotional commitment to the future of the world, because some of my favorite people struggle on the question of whether they can even keep working on environmental questions, because the prospect of failure and defeat is both so looming so large at the planetary scale and is so devastating when they lose in the particular fights. I feel fortunate in that so far I find that these are questions, this is kind of work that I can keep coming back to with the famous phrase, a kind of optimism of the will, even if I can't give you a basis for an intellectual optimism. The best I can do on the second front, that is, what concrete things do I think are there to give hope, are first that history really is surprising. It doesn't just seem surprising in hindsight, it's really surprising. The most astonishing things happen, and circumstances pivot in ways that would have seemed unimaginable not long before in all kinds of dimensions, for worse, but also quite definitely for better. And so that seems to me about all the reassurance you could ask for, that it's worth continuing to choose your metaphor, throw stones and see where the ripples go, get hold of things and see what you can do with them. Keep trying to look at ways that the experiences and resources of the past are some kind of tool for getting hold of the present. The fact that we can't know the future is scary and troubling, but I think it also counts as a source of hope, a certain minimal kind.
Well, that seems like a good note as any to finish up. Thanks so much. Really heartfelt thank from all of us for sharing your thoughts and ideas today.
Thank you.
Thanks
both.
very much.
Thank you.